The morning Cyrus Dalton's porch sprouted chickens. He stood in his doorway for a full 3 minutes without moving, staring at the 6 rust-colored hens pecking at the weathered boards like they owned every splinter. 7 years had passed since Cyrus Dalton last smiled at anything. 7 years since the fever took his wife Margaret and their unborn child in the same brutal week, leaving him with 160 acres of Texas scrubland, a barn that needed a new roof, and a silence so complete it had grown its own texture. Folks in Harlan's Creek said you could feel it when you walked past his property, a heaviness in the air, like the land itself had decided to hold its breath out of respect for whatever grief lived inside those walls. He had grown his beard long and kept his curtains drawn and paid his debts on time, and in exchange the town left him alone, which suited him just fine. The chickens, however, had not received this arrangement in writing. One of them, a particularly bold hen with a bent primary feather and eyes like 2 drops of amber whiskey, looked directly at Cyrus and made a sound that could only be described as dismissive. Then she went back to pecking. Cyrus looked left. He looked right. He looked behind him as though someone might be standing in his own kitchen to explain this, but there was no one because there was never anyone. He pulled his suspenders up, pressed his hat down, and walked toward the barn to fetch his horse, stepping carefully around the chickens the way a man steps around a problem he does not yet understand well enough to solve. He had not gone 20 yards when he heard her. "Oh, good morning. I hope they did not wake you." The voice came from the other side of his fence, the low stone wall he had built himself the summer after Margaret died, mostly as something to do with his hands. Leaning against the top of it, with her forearms resting on the flat stones and her chin tilted up in a manner that suggested she was entirely comfortable trespassing on his peace, was a woman he had never seen before. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed straw hat that had seen better decades. Her dress was practical brown cotton, collar dusty, and she had the kind of sunburned cheeks you earn from being outside when you should not be. Her eyes were the particular shade of brown that looks gold when the early light hits it directly, and the early light was hitting it directly right now. Cyrus stared at her. He was a man of 34, broad through the shoulders, with hands made rough by a decade of honest labor, and he was not accustomed to being caught off guard on his own property before 7 in the morning. "Those are your birds," he said. It was not a question. "They are," she said. She did not look apologetic. "My name is Clara Sawyer. I bought the Hennessy parcel 3 days ago." She gestured to the property that shared his eastern fence line, a sorry piece of land with a small house that had been empty for 2 years, ever since old Tom Hennessy had drunk himself flat, and his family had come to collect what was left of him. "The temporary coop I built blew apart last night in that wind. Your porch appeared to be the sturdiest structure nearby. I moved them before sunrise so they would not disturb you." "They disturbed me," Cyrus said. "Yes," Clara said, entirely untroubled. "I can see that. I will have the coop repaired by this evening and move them back. I apologize for the inconvenience." She said it the way a person says something they mean but do not particularly regret, and then she straightened up and walked back toward the Hennessy place, toward her place, and Cyrus watched her go for a moment before he turned back toward his barn. He did not smile. But something shifted, very slightly, in the rigid machinery of his face. By noon the chickens were still on his porch. He had gone past them twice, and the bold one with the bent feather had followed him to the edge of the boards and back both times as though she were supervising. Cyrus discovered at the 3rd pass that one of the hens had laid an egg near his boot scraper. He picked it up, held it, set it on the railing, and went inside to make coffee. An hour later he heard hammering from the direction of the Hennessy, Clara's property. He poured his coffee and sat in his chair and told himself he was not listening to it, but the truth was that the hammering had a rhythm to it that was not entirely unpleasant, and the silence that followed it was somehow fuller than the silence that had been there before. At dusk she came back for the chickens. He was on the porch by then, ostensibly repairing a hinge on the door that had been loose since March, and she appeared at the stone wall again with a wicker basket under one arm. "Coop is done," she said. "Better than the first one, I think." She looked at the birds, who were now roosting along his porch railing with the comfortable certainty of tenants who had paid their deposit. "I am sorry about the egg." "You can have it," Cyrus said. "That is very generous," Clara said, and climbed his fence without hesitation or ceremony, dropping down on his side of the stone wall with a small thud and brushing dust from her skirt. She began collecting chickens with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this many times in many worse circumstances. The birds went into the basket with varying degrees of protest. Cyrus watched her work. It had been a very long time since he had watched anyone do anything on this property. The quality of her attention fully given to the task, not scattered, not performing, was unusual enough that he kept watching when a more guarded man would have gone inside. "You are alone out here," he said. She paused, holding a chicken under one arm that had decided to resist collection. "I am. My husband passed 2 years ago. Cholera." She said it plainly, without asking for anything from him. "I sold what we had in Missouri and came here. Land was cheaper, and I decided I would rather be poor in a place I chose than poor in a place I stayed in by habit." Cyrus nodded. He understood that particular arithmetic. "You are alone out here," she said. It was not a question either. "I am," he said. She finished collecting the last hen, tucked the basket under her arm, and looked at him with those gold-brown eyes that were very direct and not unkind. "Well," she said, "I expect we will be neighbors for some time. I am sorry again about the porch." "The egg was good," he said. She looked at the railing where he had left it. It was still there. She tilted her head slightly. "You have not eaten it yet." "I was going to," Cyrus said. She smiled. It was brief and genuine, and not aimed at charming him. It was just the natural result of the moment, and it faded as quickly as it came. Then she went back over the fence with the basket of chickens, and the sound of her moving through the dry grass faded into the evening. Cyrus went inside. He boiled the egg. He ate it standing at the window and looked out at the dark where the Hennessy place was, where a single lamp now burned in the small window, and he thought that the dark looked slightly different with a light in it. He still did not smile. But the tightness in his chest, which he had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a constant low sound, was ever so slightly less tight. 3 days passed. He saw her in those 3 days exactly 4 times. Once when she was mending the fence along the north edge of her property. Once when she was hauling water from the creek that cut through both their lands. Once when she was on the road to Harlan's Creek in a wagon that was not quite sturdy enough for the ruts in that road. And once, very early in the morning, when he looked out his window, and she was standing in her field with her hat in her hands, looking at the sky like she was asking it something. He did not speak to her any of those times. On the 4th day she knocked on his door. He opened it to find her standing with a covered pot and a look of pragmatic determination. "I made too much stew," she said. "I have no icebox and it will go bad." It seemed wasteful not to bring it. The aroma coming off that covered pot reached him approximately 2 seconds after she finished speaking, and his body, which had been running on his own minimal cooking for 7 years, registered it before his pride could object. "Come in," he said, and stepped back. She came in. She looked at his kitchen the way someone looks at a place they are trying to understand, not with judgment but with attention. It was clean. It was spare. There was a coffee tin and a cast iron pan and the marks on the wall where someone had measured a child's height once, which she did not ask about and he saw her deliberately not ask about. She set the pot on the stove. "Do you have bowls?" she asked. "Top shelf," he said. She served them both, and they sat at the table that was too large for one person, and they ate without talking for a while, which was not uncomfortable. The stew was good beef, potatoes, onions, something he could not identify, but that was warm in the way that good food is warm, which is different from food that is merely hot. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 11 years, he said. She nodded. "The land is hard." "It is honest," he said. Hard and honest are not the same thing. She looked at him across the table. No, she said, they are not. A pause. I think I like that. The land or the distinction, he asked. Both, she said. He looked down at his bowl. He was not accustomed to conversations that moved like this one. Not slow and careful the way most of the few conversations he had in town moved, where people were watching him for signs of something, but quick and open, like she was simply thinking out loud and was not particularly worried about what he thought of the thoughts. He found he did not mind it. After she left, he stood in the kitchen for a while, and the room felt different. Not empty the way it had been empty before, but empty the way a room is empty after something good has happened in it, which is a completely different quality of emptiness. He went to bed and slept better than he had in months. The following week brought trouble that had nothing to do with chickens. Harlan's Creek was a small town, perhaps 200 souls built on the bend of a creek that had given it its name, out in the western Texas brush country in the year 1878. The town had a general store, a livery, a church, a saloon that the church officially disapproved of, a doctor who was also the dentist and the barber because that was the way of things out there, and a sheriff named Aldridge who was a fair man as long as you gave him no reason to be otherwise. It also had, in the spring of 1878, a problem that had been building for 2 years. A cattle operation run by a man named Beaumont Greer, who had decided, somewhere in his acquisition of land and money, that the laws governing those acquisitions were suggestions rather than requirements. Greer ran cattle across other people's land without permission, diverted creek water for his own stock during dry summers, and had recently taken to pressuring smaller landholders to sell to him at prices that were insults dressed as offers. Tom Hennessy, Cyrus understood, had sold the parcel to Greer's agent the way drowning men sell things, for far less than it was worth, in a moment of desperate need. Greer's agent had then sold it to Clara Sawyer, because Clara had paid actual money, and the agent did not know what Greer would want with a parcel that small, and Greer himself had been away for a month settling some legal difficulty in San Antonio. He was not away anymore. Cyrus heard about Greer's return from Pete Massey at the feed store on a Monday morning when the sky was white with heat and the air smelled like it was thinking about a storm. He's not happy about the Hennessy sale, Pete said, measuring out oats with the slow deliberateness of a man reporting something he finds interesting. Wanted that creek access. Lady who bought it controls the East Bank now. Cyrus bought his oats and said nothing and rode home and thought about it. The creek, of course. The part of the creek that cut along the shared border of their two properties was one of the only reliable water sources in a 10-mile radius during dry summer months. Clara's eastern border controlled access to a significant stretch of it. Greer's cattle operation, expanding every year, needed water badly enough that 160 acres of scrubland became valuable solely by virtue of what touched it. He thought about this. He thought about a woman alone on a property with a modest house and a rebuilt chicken coop, and a wagon that was not quite right for the ruts in the road. The next morning, he walked to her door and knocked. She opened it in her work clothes with flour on her hands, which meant she had been baking, which meant she kept domestic hours even while building coops and mending fences. She looked at him with mild surprise. It was the first time he had come to her instead of the reverse. "I need to tell you something," he said. She stepped back and let him in and did not ask any questions until he had sat down and said what he had come to say. He told her about Greer, about the creek, about the land prices, about what Pete had told him. He told it plainly and without embellishment because he was not a man who embellished. When he finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window, then at her flour-covered hands, then at him. "He will try to buy me out," she said. "Yes," Cyrus said. "And if I do not sell," Cyrus considered his answer. He had watched what Greer did to people who did not sell. It was not violent. Greer was not so crude as that. It was a slow campaign of obstruction, missing supplies, water disputes in the courts which cost money to fight, cattle that wandered across fences, the quiet kind of pressure that wore down lone people over time. He will make it difficult, he said. I see, Clara said. She was still looking at the window. Then she turned back to him and her expression was not frightened. It was calculating in the way that practical people calculate honestly without drama. I am not selling, she said. I put everything I had into this land. There is nothing to go back to. I know, he said. That is why I came. She looked at him then with something new in her expression, not gratitude exactly, though there was some of that, more like recognition, like she was seeing something about him that she had suspected but was only now confirmed. Why do you care? She said. You did not have to come. Cyrus thought about that. He thought about the lamp in the dark window. He thought about the stew that had been made in too large a quantity to eat alone. He thought about the sound of hammering that had filled up the silence in a way that was not unpleasant. You are my neighbor, he said, which was both the true answer and not the complete one, and they both understood that. All right, Clara said. What do you suggest? He had actually thought about this. It was an unusual feeling, having thought about something for someone else's sake. Document everything, he said. Your deed, your water rights, your exact property lines. I know a surveyor in Millfield who is honest. I will take you to him this week. And I will speak with Sheriff Aldridge, not to ask for protection, just to make sure he knows you are here and the property is yours. Clara nodded slowly. And you? She said, your property borders mine. Greer will have a problem with that too. Greer and I have had a problem for 3 years, Cyrus said. My creek access is on the western side. He has left me alone because I am not easy to push and there is nothing he needs from me badly enough to make it worth trying. But the eastern side is different, and now it is yours. Which puts us in this together, Clara said. Yes, Cyrus said. The word sat between them for a moment, solid and plain, and Cyrus felt the weight of it in a way that was not entirely about land and water rights. They went to Millfield the following Thursday in Cyrus's wagon, which was more reliable than hers. Clara brought her paperwork in a leather satchel she had been carrying since Missouri, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat with her hat pulled low against the morning sun, and she asked him, out of what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than small talk, how he had come to be in Harlan's Creek. So he told her. He told her about Virginia, where he had been born, and about coming west at 23 with a plan and a small inheritance and more confidence than experience. He told her about Margaret, because she had mentioned her own husband plainly, and it seemed wrong to be less honest than she was. He did not say much, just that she had been good and that the fever came fast and that afterward the land had been the thing he held on to, because you can work land and working things keeps you from certain kinds of dissolution. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, I am sorry about Margaret. I am sorry about your husband, he said. Daniel, she said. His name was Daniel. Daniel, he repeated. There was no more to say about it, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it together was not uncomfortable. It was, actually, a relief. The kind of relief that comes from being seen by someone who does not require you to perform your grief in any particular way. The surveyor in Millfield was a small, wiry man named Horace Petty, who smelled of pipe tobacco and knew his business exceptionally well. He looked at Clara's documents, asked precise questions, and confirmed that her deed was valid and her water rights to the Eastern Creek Bank were clearly stated and legally binding. He made a careful copy of the relevant documents and signed it with his seal, and Clara paid him with money she clearly counted twice to make sure she had it, and they drove back to Harlan's Creek in the long afternoon light. On the way back, something changed. It did not announce itself. There was no single moment that caused it. It was more like the way a season changes, not in one day but in the accumulation of small shifts until one morning, the quality of the air is different, and you understand that something has turned. Clara had been telling him about her garden, what she planned to plant, what the soil needed, whether the south-facing slope got enough sun, and she had a way of describing a thing she loved that made you feel the love of it even if you did not share it, and Cyrus was listening to her describe the particular stubbornness of pole beans against bad soil when he realized he was not just being polite. He was actually interested. He was listening because he wanted to know what she would say next. This was so unusual that he went very quiet, which she noticed. "Am I boring you?" she said. "No," he said. "You went quiet." "I was thinking," he said. "About pole beans," she said, and there was a warmth in it that was teasing but not unkind, and Cyrus looked at the road ahead and said, "About how long it has been since I listened to someone talk about something they cared about." And then the silence was different again, fuller, and with more in it than either of them was quite ready to say. Clara looked at the road too. "That is a lonely thing," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "It has been lonely for me too," she said. "Not in the same way. I am not a person who minds solitude. But caring about things, the land, the garden, the chickens, and having no one to say it to, that is its own kind of quiet." Cyrus nodded. He understood that perfectly. They arrived home as the sun was going orange behind the hills and the air had cooled enough to breathe easily, and he helped her down from the wagon, which required him to take her hand, which was rough from work and warm from the afternoon, and which he held for exactly the right amount of time and no longer, though letting go required a small, specific effort. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for all of this. I will speak to Aldridge tomorrow," he said. "I will start the garden Monday," she said. "The beans need to go in before it gets any hotter." He watched her walk back to her property, the satchel over her shoulder and her hat swinging by its brim from her other hand, and the evening light was doing something particular to her hair where it was coming loose from its pins, and Cyrus stood by his wagon and felt something he had not felt in so long that he had almost forgotten it had a name. He went inside and made coffee and sat in the chair where he always sat and looked at the lamp and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. Beaumont Greer came to Clara's door on a Saturday morning in late April, 2 weeks after she had moved her chickens onto Cyrus's porch. Cyrus knew about it because Pete Massey mentioned at the feed store that Greer had been seen on the road to the Hennessy place, and Cyrus rode over to find Greer's horse tied at her gate, and Greer's voice, big and smooth in the way that money makes voices smooth, coming through the open window. He tied his horse at her fence. He knocked on the door in the way that announces itself, 3 solid knocks that say I am here and you should know it. Clara opened the door, and her expression was the one she wore when she was measuring something. Greer was behind her at the table with his hat in his hand, and the particular posture of a man who considers himself a guest even when uninvited. Beaumont Greer was perhaps 50, broad through the middle with a silver mustache and the kind of tan you get from watching other men work in the sun rather than working in it yourself. He looked at Cyrus with no particular hostility, more the mild assessment of a man who is used to accounting for obstacles. "Dalton," Greer said pleasantly. "Greer," Cyrus said. "Just having a conversation with Miss Sawyer here about her property," Greer said. "She's got a beautiful piece of land. I was saying I'd be happy to take it off her hands at a fair price, let her move somewhere less remote." "I am not interested in moving somewhere less remote," Clara said. She was standing in the doorway and her voice was perfectly level. "I have said so." Greer smiled the smile of someone who does not believe the answer yet. "Piece of land this size is a lot for one woman to manage," he said, "with water disputes and weather and all manner of complications that could arise." "Are you describing complications that exist," Cyrus said, "or ones you are planning to create?" Greer's smile did not waver. "I am simply noting the realities of frontier life," he said. "This is difficult country." "Clara has her deed in order," Cyrus said. "Her water rights are documented and certified by a licensed surveyor in Millfield. Sheriff Aldridge is aware of her situation. And I have no intention of being a difficult neighbor, only a consistent one." He let that land. "Is there anything else?" There was a long moment in which Greer looked at Cyrus with the reassessment of a man recalculating. He was not a fool. He knew that Cyrus Dalton had been in Harlan's Creek for 11 years, had never caused trouble and never backed down from it either, and had the reputation of a man who meant precisely what he said. He also knew that 2 adjacent landholders with their paperwork in order and a sympathetic sheriff were considerably more trouble than one lone woman. "No," Greer said pleasantly. "Nothing else." He put his hat on and went to the door and paused. "Miss Sawyer, if you change your mind, my offer stands." He nodded at Cyrus. "Dalton." He left. They heard his horse on the road and then nothing. Clara let out a long, quiet breath. Then she went to the table and sat down and put her hands flat on it, and Cyrus came inside and sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "He will not stop," she said. "No," Cyrus said, "but he will think harder about how he goes about it. Men like Greer prefer easy pressure to difficult opposition. He will look for another angle." "What angle?" she said. "I do not know yet," Cyrus said, "but we will know it when he finds it." Clara nodded. She was looking at her hands on the table, strong hands, scarred lightly from Missouri winters and Texas work. Then she looked up. "You said we," she said. He had said that. He had not planned to say it. "Yes," he said. "You do not have to do this," she said. "It is not your fight." "Your property shares a border with mine," he said. "What happens to your water access eventually affects mine. It is practical as much as anything." He was aware, even as he said it, that it was not entirely true and that she probably knew it too. She looked at him for a moment with those direct, gold-brown eyes, and then she said, "Would you like coffee?" "Yes," he said. She got up and made it, and he sat at her table while she moved around her kitchen, her small, somewhat spare kitchen that she was making habitable by degrees, with a curtain she had made herself, and a pot of something growing on the windowsill that he did not recognize. And he thought that this was becoming a pattern, and that patterns were not things he had had in 7 years, and that this particular pattern was one he did not want to disrupt. She set the coffee in front of him and sat back down, and they talked for an hour about the fence lines and the creek and the dry season coming and what crops might survive it. And at some point, the conversation wandered away from the practical and into something else, into what she missed about Missouri, and what he did not miss about Virginia, and what the sky out here did at certain hours that you could not explain to someone who had not seen it. When he left, he realized he had been there for almost 2 hours and had not once thought about the silence in his house. May arrived hot and fragrant and full of activity. Clara planted her garden. It was a large garden for one person, ambitious in the way that hopeful people are ambitious, with beans and squash, and tomatoes in neat rows along the south-facing slope, and a small bed of herbs near the back door that smelled like thyme and something sweet he could not name. Cyrus found himself walking that direction sometimes when he was doing his own outside work, not specifically to see her, but finding that she was there, and that this was not unpleasant. They fell into a rhythm that neither of them named. He would sometimes fix a thing that needed fixing on her property, not because she asked, but because he was there and it was in front of him, and leaving a broken thing alone went against his nature. She would sometimes bring food, not because he needed it, but because she cooked for 2 out of habit and the habit had found its purpose. They ate together more often than not, either at her table or his, and the conversation was always easy in the way of conversations that do not need to construct themselves. He learned things about her. She had grown up in Indiana before Missouri. She had 2 brothers, both living, one in Kansas and one in Ohio. She read when she could get books, which was difficult out here, and she had a habit of reading the same books multiple times rather than going without. She was stubborn in a specific way, not the way of someone who never changes their mind, but the way of someone who requires a good reason to change it and does not accept poor reasons on principle. She was funny, in a dry, understated way that you had to be paying attention to catch, and he found himself paying attention. She learned things about him. He had been a school teacher for 2 years before coming west, and still read more than most people expected. He had built his house himself except for the chimney, which required a mason, and he was quietly proud of it in the way of a man who does not boast. He had a dog once, a border collie named Walker, who had died the previous winter of old age, and he had not gotten another one because the house felt like it had been through enough loss. He was patient in the way of a man who has decided that patience is simply how time passes when you have no alternative. But he was also, she discovered, capable of humor when he thought no one was expecting it. The first time he made her genuinely laugh, really laugh, not the polite kind but the kind that surprises you out of yourself, was at the general store on a Wednesday in late May. They had gone in together, which people in Harlan's Creek noticed with the quiet intensity of people who have little else to notice. Mrs. Ames behind the counter watched them the way a cat watches a door. Clara was debating the purchase of a particular bolt of fabric for a practical reason. She needed to recover a chair, and Cyrus was pretending to examine nails while actually listening to her explain to Mrs. Ames why the blue was not right and the brown was too much. "What about green, Mrs. Ames said helpfully. "Green would look like I found it growing," Clara said. "Well," Cyrus said, not looking up from the nails, "you did once find a chicken coop growing on my porch." There was a pause, and then Clara laughed, that full, surprised laugh, and Mrs. Ames blinked, and Cyrus very carefully continued examining the nails with the expression of a man who has no idea what anyone is laughing about. But the corner of his mouth had moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the neighbor of one. And Clara saw it, and something in her expression became quiet and glad at the same time, and she looked back at the fabric very quickly. June brought the dry season, and with it, Greer's second angle. It came through the courthouse rather than through direct confrontation, which was exactly what Cyrus had predicted. Greer filed a petition with the county, claiming that the survey of the Hennessy parcel had been done incorrectly years ago, and that the Eastern Creek Bank actually fell within land he had purchased 2 years prior. It was the kind of claim that had no merit but required time and money to disprove, which was precisely the point. Clara came to Cyrus's door the evening she received the notice, and she was not crying. She was the kind of woman who processed fear into determination, but her hands, when she showed him the document, were not entirely steady. He read it carefully. He had read enough documents in his years out here to understand the shape of a bad-faith legal maneuver, and this was one. "He is wrong," he said. "Horace Petty's survey will show it." "Petty is in Millfield," she said. "The hearing is in Caldwell County Courthouse. That is 60 miles, and there is a fee to file the response." He looked at her. "How much of a fee?" She named a number that, from the slight compression of her mouth when she said it, was not nothing to her. He thought about it for exactly as long as it required. "I will cover the fee," he said. "Cyrus," she said. "I will recover it in due time," he said. "You are not in a position to let this go uncontested, and a contested claim is better than an uncontested one." "I cannot simply let you, Clara," he said, and her name in his mouth had the quality of something practiced but still new. "You can, and you will. And when this is settled and the garden comes in, you can pay me back in pole beans." She looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes were doing something complicated that he did not try to decode. "Pole beans," she said finally. "And whatever else survives," he said. Something in her face relaxed. "You are a stubborn man," she said. "I have been told," he said. She went home, and he sat on his porch in the cooling evening and looked at the Milky Way, which was doing what it always did out here, making every human concern feel small without making it feel less real, and thought about what he was doing. He was not naive about it. He was helping a neighbor, yes. He was protecting adjacent land from a man who had been a nuisance for years, yes. But he was also, if he was honest, and he had always been honest with himself, it was the one discipline he had not let go of. He was also doing it because Clara Sawyer had walked into the silence around him and had made it bearable in a way he had not expected and could not now imagine undoing. He was careful with this thought. He had loved Margaret. He had built a life with her in this house on this land, and her absence had left something structural in him permanently altered. He did not think that what he felt about Clara erased any of that. They were two different countries, grief and new feeling, and you could live in both without betraying either. He was not sure what Clara felt. He thought he saw things, the way she sometimes looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, the slight change in her voice when she said his name, the fact that she kept coming back when she did not strictly need to. But he had been wrong about things before, and he was out of practice with certainty. So he was careful and patient. And he went to Millfield himself to speak to Horace Petty, who was professionally offended by the insinuation that his survey had been incorrect, and agreed immediately to provide testimony to that effect at the county hearing, which helped considerably. The hearing was in July. Cyrus went with Clara. They rode the 60 miles to the Caldwell County Courthouse over 2 days, camping one night at a creek they both knew by reputation. And around the campfire, Clara read aloud from the one book she had brought, a collection of essays. She had read enough times that some pages were soft from handling. And her voice in the dark beside the fire was something he wanted to memorize without being certain he was allowed to. The hearing went as Horace Petty's thorough documentation suggested it would. The judge was a practical man who had seen this type of creative land claim before, and he dismissed Greer's petition within the hour, with a note in the record that reflected poorly on the merit of the original filing. Clara kept her face composed throughout. She was very good at keeping her face composed under pressure, but when they walked out of the courthouse into the blazing July sun, she stopped on the steps and breathed in a very particular way that told him everything about what the past weeks had cost her. He stood beside her on the steps, a little closer than he usually stood, and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say, and the silence he offered was not the old, empty kind. It was the kind that means I am here and you are not alone in this. After a moment she said, "Pole beans." "Yes," he said. "I mean it," she said. "I am paying you back in pole beans." "I know," he said. They rode home and camped again the second night. And this time he built the fire and she made the food, and they talked until late in the way of two people who have stopped monitoring how much they say. She talked about Daniel without sadness, just as a fact of her history, as a person who had been real and mattered and was gone. He talked about Margaret the same way, and they were the first time he had said her name aloud in years that it did not feel like pressing on a wound. It felt like saying the name of someone who had been real and mattered, and who would, if they could have chosen, have wanted him to be here, warm beside a fire with someone to talk to. He thought that. He believed it. It did not fix the absence, but it changed its quality. They arrived home on a Thursday afternoon, and the chickens, his 6 rust-colored tenants who still visited his porch with some regularity, drawn by habit and the bold hen's independent nature, were waiting on his fence rail as though they had expected them. Clara laughed when she saw them. "Harriet," she said, "the bent-feathered one. She has always had opinions about where she ought to be." "Harriet," Cyrus said. "I have been calling her Other One." Clara looked at him. "Other One." "In relation to the others," he said. "She was clearly different. I had to call her something." Clara was smiling. "You named a chicken Other One." "I did not name her," he said. "I labeled her." "There is a difference." She laughed again, not the surprised kind this time, but the warm, easy kind that means you are delightful, and he felt it somewhere low in his chest, warm and specific. He gathered himself because he was a man who was careful with himself. "Clara," he said. She looked at him, still smiling slightly, and her hat was crooked from the ride and there was dust on her collar, and she had never in the time he had known her looked anything other than exactly like herself, which was, he had come to understand, the thing about her that mattered most. "I would like to ask you to supper," he said. "Not because you brought extra food and I am returning the favor, but because I would like to cook for you and have you at my table for the purpose of having you there." She was quiet for a moment. The smile was still there, but different now, softer, with something behind it. "That is a very precise invitation," she said. "I am a precise person," he said. "You are," she said. "When is supper?" "Sunday," he said. 6 o'clock. "I will be there," she said. She got down from the wagon and walked to her gate, and Harriet the chicken got down from the fence rail and followed her to the edge of the property with great dignity. Clara paused at the gate and looked back at him with that same soft smile, and then she went in. Cyrus sat in the wagon for a moment. Then he got down and unhitched the horse and put the horse away and went inside his house, and he stood in the kitchen looking at nothing. He was going to cook for a woman. He was going to have someone at his table for the purpose of having them there. He had not done that in 7 years. He had not smiled in 7 years, and something in his face right now was doing something that had not done that in 7 years, and he was aware of it without quite being ready to name it. He started planning the meal. Sunday arrived. He cooked a proper meal, not his usual sparse bachelor fare, but something that required thought and time, and a trip to the general store for things he did not keep on hand. He made a beef roast with the herbs he grew himself along the south wall, and potatoes, and bread from a recipe Margaret had taught him that he had not used since, and which came back to his hands like something that had been waiting rather than lost. He cleaned the house in a way that was thorough rather than merely habitual. He did not have many decorative items. The house was practical and spare, but he had kept Margaret's blue pitcher on the windowsill because he liked the color, and he filled it with the wild verbena that grew along the fence, which was purple and which looked right with the blue. Clara arrived at 6 o'clock exactly, which he would later reflect was a perfect expression of her character. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, dark blue, simple but with a little more care in it than her usual, and her hair was different, pinned up with more intention. She looked at the house and at the flowers in the pitcher and at the table set for two, and she said nothing, but the way she breathed told him things. "You cooked," she said. "I said I would," he said. She looked at him. "You said supper. You did not say you would cook something that smells like that." "I may have been understated about the specifics," he said. They sat down and he served her and they ate, and the conversation was everything it had been for the past 2 months, and also something more, the awareness between them of why they were here in this particular way, with the flowers in the pitcher and the bread that had required effort. She tasted the bread and went quiet for a moment. "This is very good," she said. "Where did you learn to make this?" "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "She taught you well," she said. "Yes," he said. "She did." He looked at his plate, and then at the window, and then back at Clara. "I think she would have liked you," he said, and he meant it, and he had not said anything like it to anyone in 7 years, and the saying of it was both harder and easier than he expected. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Daniel would have shaken your hand and told you your fence lines were better than his," she said. "He was always straightforward about what he admired in other people." "He sounds like a good man," Cyrus said. "He was," she said. "I was lucky to have had him." A pause. "It does not mean I am not here now in this place, looking for what this place has." He met her eyes. There was no ambiguity in what she meant, and she had never been a woman who used ambiguity as cover. He appreciated that more than he could say. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, in the tone of someone who has already said yes to the actual question even though it has not been asked. "I am not practiced at this," he said. "I have been alone a long time, and I have gotten comfortable with it in the way of a man who has stopped noticing how cold he is." "I know," she said. "But I notice the cold now," he said, "specifically when you are not nearby." She looked at him with those gold-brown eyes, and something in them was full and warm and direct. "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard," she said, "from a man who was just comparing himself to a cold house." "I am not practiced," he said. "I know," she said again. "I like that you told me the truth instead of something more polished." He reached across the table and covered her hand with those rough, warm, work-made hands that she had held briefly once before and thought about more than once since. She turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that for a moment while the evening light came through the window and the verbena in the blue pitcher made its small, purple argument for beauty in an otherwise spare room. "We are going slowly," he said. "We can go as slowly as you need," she said. "I have nowhere to be," he said, "except here." She smiled. And he looked at her smiling and felt the thing in his face do the thing it had not done in 7 years, And this time he did not stop it, because it was real and it was earned, and she had, without demanding it, given him something worth smiling at. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile a man makes who has not made one in a long time, careful and real, like a muscle used for the first time after a long stillness. But it was genuine, and it reached his eyes, and Clara saw it, and her own expression went soft and bright at once, and she did not make a fuss of it, which was exactly right. They finished supper. They talked until the moon was high. She helped him with the dishes because she was not a woman who sat while someone else worked, and they stood at his basin with their arms close together and washed dishes and passed them back and forth and did not need to talk every moment. When she left, he walked her to the fence, and she crossed to her side and turned back and said, "Thank you for supper, Cyrus." "Thank you for coming," he said. She looked at him in the moonlight, and the night air was cool and full of crickets, and the sky was enormous the way it only is out here, and she said, "Same time next Sunday." "Same time," he said. She went. He went back inside and sat in his chair and looked at the lamp, and did not feel the particular quality of emptiness that had lived in this room for 7 years. What followed was the summer that Cyrus Dalton remembered for the rest of his life as the summer everything changed, which was accurate, and which he would eventually, years later, sitting on his porch with considerably more noise and life around him, describe to his children as the summer he woke up. They had Sunday suppers at his house. They had Saturday mornings at hers, over coffee and whatever she had baked, which was usually good and sometimes experimental, and once spectacularly wrong in a way that made them both laugh until the kitchen felt too small to hold it. They rode together to Harlan's Creek and back, and to the neighboring ranches when Cyrus needed to settle grazing arrangements and Clara came along, because she was curious, and because two people presenting a united front is always more effective than one person presenting a confused one. Greer made no further legal moves. He was not gone from the horizon. Men with money and a sense of entitlement rarely disappear entirely, but he had recalculated his cost to benefit and found the math insufficient. Cyrus heard through Massey at the feed store that Greer had bought another parcel to the south with better access, and while that did not mean he had forgotten the Eastern Creek Bank, it meant the pressure had eased. Sheriff Aldridge had been quietly helpful throughout, not in any official capacity but in the way of a fair man who makes his presence known in the right places, and Cyrus thanked him for it in the way men thank each other in that time and place, directly and simply, with a handshake and an acknowledgement, and that was sufficient. The garden came in well. The pole beans were prodigious, so prodigious that Clara brought Cyrus 3 large baskets in late July with the expression of a woman honoring a debt, and he accepted them with the expression of a man who is quietly delighted by the precision of her follow-through. He made soup. He brought her a jar of it over the fence the next morning. She had it for lunch and sent back the jar with a piece of pie in it. He ate the pie for breakfast, which was probably not respectable, and then went about his day feeling considerably better about it than he should have. Harriet the chicken continued to visit his porch with no reduction in confidence. He began, at some point he could not precisely identify, to bring her scraps. He did this quietly, when no one was watching, because he was aware that a man who had named a chicken other one and was now deliberately feeding her was a man who had perhaps become more invested than dignity strictly allowed. Clara noticed anyway. She always noticed. One morning she was crossing from her property and saw the scraps on the porch rail and looked at Cyrus with an expression of such fond amusement that he felt it in his chest. "Those are kitchen scraps," he said. "From cooking. It is practical not to waste them." "Of course," she said. "I have no particular attachment to the bird," he said. "Naturally," she said. "She just happens to be here," he said. "Harriet does tend to be where she wants to be," Clara said, and went inside, and he heard her laughing softly once she thought she was out of earshot, and he stood on the porch and felt the smile come back easier this time, like a door that has been opened enough that it swings freely now. August brought a heat that was not gentle. The land turned the color of old wheat, and the creek dropped, and the air shimmered in the afternoons like something alive. Cyrus worked his cattle through it, and Clara tended her garden through it, and they were both stubborn enough not to complain about the heat except to each other, which was somehow different from complaining in general. One afternoon in mid-August, the heat was so specific and unreasonable that Cyrus went to the creek with a towel and stopped in surprise because Clara was already there, sitting with her feet in the water and her boots beside her, reading one of her well-traveled books. She looked up when she heard him, and neither of them was particularly embarrassed. "The south end is cold," she said. "There is a spring feeding in." "I know," he said. "I found it 12 years ago." "It is a good spot," she said. "Yes," he said. He sat beside her, not quite touching, and took his boots off, and put his feet in the water, which was cold in the specific way of spring-fed creeks even in August. And they sat in companionable quiet and did not read and listened to the creek move and the birds in the cottonwoods. And at some point, her shoulder was resting lightly against his, and neither of them moved away. He looked at her reading, and he thought, "I want this." Not as a vague ambition, but as a specific, daily, permanent thing. I want to sit beside her at creeks in August heat and let the silence between us be of this quality, which is the best quality of silence I have encountered. He also thought, I need to say something, not yet, but soon. She closed her book. She looked at the water. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I came out here because I had nothing left in Missouri," she said. "I told myself it was practical, cheaper land, fresh start, room to grow something. And all of that is true." She paused. "But I think the truth is that I also came out here hoping to find out that I could still want things. That losing Daniel had not taken that from me, the capacity to look at a future and feel something about it other than obligation." Cyrus was listening with his whole attention. "I feel something about it now," she said. She did not look at him. "More than I expected to, different from what I expected." A pause. "I wanted you to know that." He was quiet for a moment because what she had just said required a real answer and not a practiced one. "I have been in a kind of suspension," he said carefully. "For 7 years. Not bad, exactly, not suffering every moment, just still. Like a clock that still shows the right time twice a day but is not actually running." He looked at the water. "You are the thing that started it running again. I did not know until it started that it had stopped." She turned to look at him. They were very close because of the shoulder contact that had happened gradually, and in the afternoon light her eyes were entirely gold. "Cyrus," she said. "Clara," he said. And then, because they were both people who had spent enough time being careful and enough time being alone to know the cost of hesitation when a thing is right, he kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. There was no theatrical moment or particular flourish. It was careful and real and warm, like everything else about them, and when it was over they both stayed very still for a moment and looked at the creek. "Well," Clara said softly. "Well," he said. "I think," she said, "I may have moved my chickens onto your porch for a reason that had nothing to do with the coop." He looked at her. "You said the coop blew apart." "It did," she said. "But Harriet has never gone anywhere she did not choose to go." He thought about that. He thought about the bent-feathered hen who had appeared on his porch, like a small ambassador with opinions. He thought about Clara leaning on the stone wall in the early morning with flour on her hands and that straw hat and those eyes that saw straight through everything. He thought about 7 years of silence and the specific way it had filled when she moved into it. "You sent your chicken first," he said. "I sent the one most likely to make a favorable impression," she said. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed, really laughed, from the place where laughter lives in 7 years. And it felt the way cold water feels when you have been very thirsty, sudden and real and more than you expected. Clara looked at him, and her face did something radiant at the sound of it. And Harriet, who had wandered to the creek bank in the meantime and was drinking with the self-possession of a bird who has accomplished her mission, ruffled her feathers and looked satisfied. September in Harlan's Creek brought the first hints of cooler weather, and with them, a change in pace. The cattle needed to be moved to the fall pastures. The garden needed to be harvested and put up for winter. The wood needed to be cut and stacked. And the particular quality of urgency that comes with the end of summer in a place where winters are mild but not nothing settled over the land. Cyrus and Clara worked together through much of it. It was not arranged. It was just the natural result of two adjacent properties and two people who had become accustomed to the fact that more could be done in less time with two pairs of hands and two minds working toward it. He helped her get in the last of the garden. She helped him repair the barn roof that he had been putting off, not in the physical sense. She was a capable woman, but barn roofing was not a safe solo endeavor, but in the sense of being on the ground and handing up materials and keeping him company at a height that required focusing on the work rather than the distance. The town noticed. Towns always notice. Mrs. Ames at the general store had been noticing since May and had strong opinions about it that she shared with whoever came through the door, which was most people at some point during the week. The general consensus in Harlan's Creek was that it was about time, a sentiment that might have offended Cyrus 7 months ago, but which he now found he did not particularly mind. Pete Massey said, "She seems like a good woman," at the feed store in September, in the way that Pete said things he had been composing for a while. "She is," Cyrus said. "You seem different," Pete said. "Do I?" Cyrus said. "You look at things," Pete said. "You used to look through things." Cyrus paid for his feed and considered this. "Yes," he said, "that is accurate." He went home and thought about that. He looked at his property, the house, the barn, the stone wall, the land running out to the south and east, and he looked at it with new eyes, which were actually his old eyes returned, the eyes that had cared about this place when he built it and for a long time afterward. He had stopped caring about it as something to tend and begun treating it as merely something to maintain, which is different. Now he was caring again. He noticed where the south garden wall needed work. He noticed that the house could use paint on the east-facing boards. He noticed that the porch where 6 chickens had appeared one morning in March, was actually a fine porch, with a good view of the sunset if you sat in the right spot, and that he had not sat in the right spot in years. He sat in the right spot that evening. Clara appeared at the stone wall while he was sitting there, and he raised a hand, and she came over, not climbing the fence this time, but coming through the gate he had built properly at the property line in June, a practical addition that had required no discussion about what it meant. She sat beside him on the porch steps, and they watched the sunset do what it did out here, which was unreasonable and magnificent and different every evening. The sky went pink and then orange and then a particular shade of red that had no good name and then purple, and then everything softened into the first stars. "I have been thinking," Cyrus said. "About what?" she said. He had been thinking about this for several weeks. He was a careful man who did not act without deliberation, but he was also a man who had learned, in the years since Margaret, what the cost of irreversible hesitation was. "About what comes next," he said. Clara was very still beside him. "Your property and mine share a fence line," he said, "and a creek, and a number of other things that have become increasingly indistinct from each other over the past several months." He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees. "I would like to propose that the fence line becomes a formality." She turned to look at him. "That is a very precise way to ask something," she said. "I am a precise person," he said, and she laughed softly because she had said that to him once and he had remembered it. "Clara," he turned to look at her in the last of the light, "I love you. I did not expect to love anyone again. I was not looking for it, and I was not sure I deserved it, and I am certain I will be imperfect at it in the specific ways of a man who has been alone too long, but I love you, and I would like to know if you will marry me." She looked at him. Her expression was the one she wore when she was measuring something, and he understood that what she was measuring now was real and important, and that he was willing to wait for the answer as long as it required. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He let out a breath that he understood in the releasing had been held for a long time. "Good," he said. "Good," she said, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they watched the last of the light go out of the sky, and the first stars multiplied, and Harriet the chicken, who had been roosting on the porch rail with her customary poise, settled deeper into her feathers and looked at the night with the satisfaction of a bird whose work here was done. They were married in October, at the small church in Harlan's Creek, on a day when the air was finally cool and the mesquite was doing what it does in autumn, which is not spectacular but is genuine. The preacher was a man named Brother Elias who had seen 30 years of frontier marriages and appreciated the ones that had earned their way to the altar, which this one had. Clara wore a dress she had made herself, not the brown cotton of daily work, but something in soft cream that she had ordered the fabric for in August, which meant she had been thinking about it in August, which Cyrus noted with quiet pleasure. Her hair was pinned up with more care than usual, and she carried a small bunch of wild verbena from the same patch that grew along his fence, the purple kind he had put in Margaret's blue pitcher on their first real Sunday supper. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the short aisle toward him and felt all of it at once, the 7 years, and the morning on the porch with the 6 chickens, and the creek in August heat, and the laugh that had come back like something returning from exile, and the feeling was so complete and so specific that it required no translation. Pete Massey was there, looking emotional in a way he would later deny. Mrs. Ames was there, looking vindicated in a way she would not deny at all. Sheriff Aldridge was there, solid and smiling. Several neighbors who had watched Cyrus Dalton be alone for 7 years and hoped, quietly, for something better were there. Horace Petty had sent a letter from Millfield, which Clara read aloud to Cyrus that evening and which said, among other practical congratulations, that he had never in his professional experience seen a property line dispute resolved so satisfactorily. The words that Cyrus and Clara said to each other in front of Brother Elias were the traditional ones, because neither of them were people who needed novelty in ceremony. But when Brother Elias said, "You may kiss your bride," and Cyrus kissed Clara in front of 30 people, and the afternoon light coming through the small church windows, Mrs. Ames cried, and Pete Massey blew his nose loudly and then looked away, and the practical people of Harlan's Creek felt, as a collective body, that some balance in the universe had been restored. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the church grounds, food that the town women had organized, which was generous, and Clara told Cyrus quietly, far more than she had expected. Cyrus shook hands and Clara accepted embraces, and they moved through it together the way they moved through everything, in close orbit, and with the ease of 2 people who know exactly where the other one is. At some point in the evening, when the celebration was quieting and the families were heading home in the cool October dark, Clara found him standing near the fence of the church yard, looking at the stars, and she came to stand beside him. "Happy?" she said. "Yes," he said, without qualification or hesitation, and it was true in the simple way that the most true things are true directly, without needing defense. They went home to his house. Their house, and it felt different already. The way a place feels different when the person it has been missing walks into it and fills the shape they have always been meant to fill. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was mild by Texas standards, which meant cold at night and warm enough in the afternoons that you could work outside in a coat without suffering. Cyrus and Clara settled into the house together with the efficiency of 2 practical people who had each lived alone long enough to know their own habits and who were willing now to let those habits renegotiate themselves around another person. There were adjustments. He liked silence in the early morning. She liked to talk through her plans for the day while making coffee, which meant a specific kind of early morning noise. She adjusted by waiting until the first cup was done before speaking. He adjusted by discovering that the morning planning was actually useful, and that he had simply never had it before. She stacked things in ways that differed from his. He left tools in places that confused her until she learned the logic of them, which was the logic of a man who always reached for the same thing in the same spot without looking. These negotiations were conducted without drama, mostly because neither of them were dramatic people, and partly because they had each been alone long enough to find compromise genuinely preferable to stubbornness about small things. Clara moved her chickens properly, a real coop, built by both of them on the south side of the house where the morning light was good. Harriet took to the new arrangement with the adaptability of a bird who has always known that good accommodations are wherever she decides they are. The other 5 hens settled in with various degrees of enthusiasm. Greer was quiet through the winter. Cyrus heard, through Massey, that the southern parcel had proved more profitable than expected, and that Greer was redirecting his energy toward expanding in that direction. The eastern creek bank remained Clara and Cyrus's, and the water rights remained clear, and the fence remained on the surveyed line, and over time the matter became simply one of those things that had happened and been resolved, leaving behind nothing but the documentation in Horace Petty's files. Clara's brothers both wrote letters when they heard of the marriage. The one in Kansas sent practical congratulations and a useful recommendation about winter planting. The one in Ohio sent a longer letter that Clara read and then folded and kept in her satchel, and when Cyrus asked about it, she said he had said he was glad she sounded like herself again. Cyrus wrote a letter to Margaret's mother in Virginia, an old woman who had been kind to him even in her grief and who had written every Christmas since Margaret died, letters he had answered briefly and with difficulty. He told her he had married again. He told her about Clara. He told her that this did not diminish what Margaret had been to him and what she had given him. He did not know if the old woman would understand this, but he felt it was true and felt she deserved the truth. The letter she wrote back came in February, and it said, among other things, "Margaret always said you were made for a house full of life, and I believe she was right, and I am glad you have found it." He gave the letter to Clara because she asked what it said and because he did not want to have secrets from her, and she read it carefully and then set it down and said, "She sounds like a woman who loved her daughter very much." "She did," he said. "I would like that," Clara said, "being loved that way by children, having that kind of love move forward." He looked at her. She was not looking at him, she was looking at the letter on the table, and he thought about what she had said. "Yes," he said. By spring, the spring of 1879, a full year after the chickens, Clara was expecting their first child. She told him on a morning in April in the kitchen over coffee, with the directness that characterized everything she did. "I am going to have a baby," she said. "I believe in November." He put his coffee cup down and looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Margaret and the child that had not been born and the 7 years after. He thought about what this meant, the specific weight and hope and terror of it. He thought about Clara, who was watching him with that steady gaze, not asking him to perform any particular response, just giving him the truth and waiting to see what he did with it. He got up and went to her and took her hands. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am well," she said. "I am frightened the appropriate amount. Are you all right?" "Yes," he said and meant it. I am more than all right." She looked at his face for a moment and then leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her. And they stood in the kitchen, while the April morning came through the window and Harriet the chicken made her opinions known from the yard, and the house held them the way it had held everything. All the grief and all the hope and all the long quiet years in this, which was new and frightening, and exactly what it should be. The spring and summer of 1879 were busy. The property, both parcels, now legally combined, needed work that 2 people together could plan more ambitiously than one alone. Cyrus added a room to the house. Not a grand addition, practical, with good proportions and the same quality of work that the rest of the house had, because he could not do a thing poorly when he had time to do it properly. Clara supervised the details of it while managing her garden, which was bigger this year than last because She had 2 years of soil knowledge and a stubbornness about not repeating the same failures twice. They hired a hand through the summer, a young man named Sam Torres from a family that had been in the Texas brush country for 2 generations, who was quiet and capable, and who could read people well enough to know when he was needed and when he was in the way. Sam handled the cattle work when Cyrus was occupied with construction, and did it with a competence that made him easy to trust and easy to keep. Sam also, in the way of young men around a household that was working and warm, began to have a life around the property that was more than just employment. He ate lunch at the back step some days and talked with Clara about things when Cyrus was in the fields, and Clara gave him books when he showed an interest in them, and he returned them read, which she respected. He was 20 and capable and working with the energy of someone building towards something, and Cyrus gave him room to do that because he remembered what it was to be 20 and working with that same energy. The summer was hot again, as Texas summers always are, but this one had a different quality, not the silent heat of a man alone on his land, but the busy heat of a household with purpose, with plans, with future written into the fence posts they were replacing, and the room they were building, and the garden that was coming in better every year. Harriet was still there. She had become, without any formal decision, the head chicken, a position she had clearly always believed was hers by right. She laid reliably, supervised the other birds with an authority that brooked no argument, and continued to favor the porch, where Cyrus had long since accepted that the scraps would be left, and that this was simply the arrangement. Clara caught him talking to her once, just telling her about the fence work, describing the posts and the weather and something about the cattle, in the way you talk to a dog when you think no one is listening. He was not embarrassed. He had gone past the point where he maintained pretenses about what the chicken meant, because the chicken had been the beginning of all of this, and he was not about to be ungrateful. The baby came in November, 3 weeks early and fast, the way first children sometimes decide to arrive with more energy than consideration for timing. Dr. Haversham was there, who handled all of this as efficiently as he handled teeth and hair. Cyrus was outside on the porch for the relevant hours, which was where men were sent to be in 1879, because the doctor had firm opinions about the organization of difficult things, and Cyrus Dalton being inside during a complicated delivery was not part of his efficient system. He was on the porch. It was cold, a real Texas November cold, which is not the cold of the north but is its own kind of serious, and the stars were very clear, and Harriet was roosting on the porch rail, because Harriet was always where she chose to be and cold did not change her choices. The sound came and he was through the door in a moment, and the doctor came out of the bedroom with his sleeves rolled and said, "A boy, both well, both well." He went in. Clara was exhausted in the profound way of women who have just done the hardest physical work of their lives, and she was also radiant in the way that is specific to that moment. Not a pretty radiance, but a real one from within, from having gotten through something enormous and come out the other side. The baby was in her arms, wrapped in the blanket she had made over the summer, and he was very small and had a great deal of dark hair, and the look of someone who had important opinions and no mechanism yet to express them. Cyrus sat beside her and looked at his son and felt something that had no name in any language he knew, a kind of fullness that was also a kind of terrifying, because there was now something in the world that he would love so fiercely that its existence permanently altered the stakes of everything. "Hello," he said to the baby, because it seemed right to introduce himself. Clara laughed softly. "He cannot hear you very well yet," she said. "He is hearing me," Cyrus said with the certainty of a man who believes this. "He is just thinking about it." "What will we call him?" Clara said. They had discussed names. They had several candidates, but looking at his son now, Cyrus said, "James." James Daniel Dalton. James for no particular reason except that it was right, and Daniel for a man who had been good and gone too soon, and whose name should go forward. Clara looked at the baby and then at him. James Daniel, she said, testing it. Yes, that is right. James Daniel Dalton arrived in November 1879 and filled the house with noise and growth and the complete reorganization of priorities that babies manage simply by existing. Sam Torres became indispensable through the winter, handling the outdoor work while Cyrus divided his attention between the property and the interior world of a house with a newborn, which required a different kind of management than anything he had done before. He discovered he was good at it. Not the way some things you discover you are good at, with surprise, but the way of something that had always been there, unused. He was patient and he was consistent, and he could be awake at hours that should not require wakefulness, without losing the ability to function at the hours that required it, which was the essential survival skill of a parent in the early months. Clara recovered and returned to herself and was more herself than before, somehow, as though the experience had clarified something. She was nursing James and managing the household, and within 3 months was also back in the garden with planning in her expression and a whole new season's ambitions in her mind. "You are remarkable," Cyrus told her once, watching her do 3 things at once with James on her hip. She looked at him with mild surprise. "I am practical," she said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "You have gotten better at this." "At what?" he said. "At saying what you think," she said. "You used to say very little." "I had very little to say," he said. "I have more now," she smiled. That smile, the warm, easy one, the one that had started as brief and rare and had become frequent and given freely, the one that he had come to think of as the sound of a house becoming a home. The years moved. They moved in the way good years move, not slowly and not too fast, but with the quality of time spent in motion rather than stillness, which is the better way to spend it. The spring of 1881 brought a second child, a girl this time, born in May when the verbena was blooming along the fence, and the property was green in the brief, beautiful way of Texas spring. They named her Margaret Rose. Margaret for the woman who had taught him to make bread and to love a place, and whose memory he had carried for 7 years and could now carry with something other than sorrow. And Rose for the small rose plant Clara had been trying to establish along the south wall for 2 years, which had finally decided to cooperate. Margaret Rose was different from James in the way second children are different, calmer, more observant, with the particular quality of a person taking notes from the beginning. She had Clara's eyes, that gold-brown color that looked amber in certain lights, and she had Cyrus's stubbornness, which manifested early and often and with great precision. Harriet was still alive. She was very old by chicken standards and moved more slowly, and did not supervise the other birds with quite the same executive authority, but she still roosted on the porch rail with the dignity of someone who has earned her position. Cyrus still brought her scraps. James, when he was old enough to understand the arrangement, accepted it with the seriousness of a child who has been told something is important and takes that seriously. The property grew. Not dramatically. Cyrus was not a man who expanded for the sake of expansion, but steadily, the way a well-managed thing grows. A second barn, better fencing, a proper vegetable cellar that Clara had wanted since the first winter. Sam Torres stayed on permanently, and in the spring of 1882 he married a woman named Elena Reyes from a nearby ranch, and they built a small house on the northeast corner of the property, and the household became more complex and more alive in the way of places where people put down real roots. The injustice of the era was not abstract in Harlan's Creek. The Torres family, Sam, his parents, his brothers had roots in Texas land that went back before the American flag was raised over it, and the legal mechanisms of the period were not always friendly to those roots. Cyrus had watched this happen to other families in the county and found it wrong in the plain way that he found plain things wrong, and he made it his business to understand Sam's land rights and to use his own standing in the county to support them when occasions arose. It was not heroism, it was decency, which is what he had always been better at than anything else. Sam knew it and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. In 1883, Beaumont Greer sold his operation and moved to San Antonio, which was, as Pete Massey noted at the feed store, about as satisfying an outcome as you could reasonably hope for without wishing the man specific ill. The Eastern Creek bank remained undisturbed, as it had been for 5 years, and the water flowed without dispute through the property that had started as 160 acres of scrubland bought by a widow with everything she had, and was now something considerably more. That summer, the summer of 1883, Cyrus and Clara sat on their porch on a particular evening in August when the air had a quality that made you want to stay outside forever, and James was 4 and asleep inside, and Margaret Rose was 2 and also asleep, and Sam and Alina were at their own house, and the property was quiet in the way it is quiet when the quiet comes from completion rather than absence. Clara had her feet up on the railing and her head leaning against his shoulder. He had his arm around her. The stars were doing what they always did out here, which was everything, and the verbena was blooming along the fence in the dusk. "Do you remember the morning I moved the chickens?" She said. "I was thinking about it just now," he said. She looked up at him. "You were, the look on your face," he said. "When you explained it, you were not apologetic." "I was a little apologetic," she said. "You were not," he said. "You said sorry, but you were not sorry. You were watching to see what I would do." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I was." A pause. "What did I see?" He thought about it. "A man standing in his own doorway not knowing what to do with 6 chickens," he said, "which I understand is probably not intimidating." She laughed softly. "You were very serious about those chickens," she said. "I take unexpected intrusions seriously," he said. "I know," she said. "I noticed." She settled her head back against his shoulder. "I noticed you were serious and careful, and that you came to tell me about Greer when you did not have to, and that you made bread from a recipe that was not yours to share anymore, but you shared it, and that you talked to Harriet when you thought no one was listening." "I talked to Harriet because she has opinions and someone should acknowledge them," he said. "Cyrus," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad I let the coop blow down," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am very glad it blew down too." From inside the house, some sound that was James's specific pre-waking sound, a movement, a small voice, and then quiet again. Cyrus listened to it with the full attention of a parent who has learned to read the particular vocabulary of their child's sleep, and it passed back into nothing. He thought about all of it. The morning with the chickens, the pot of stew brought over a fence, the surveyor in Millfield and the courthouse in Caldwell County, and the campfire and the creek in August, and the porch steps and the stars. He thought about 7 years of silence and what it had cost him, and about one morning in March 1878 when 6 rust-colored hens appeared on his porch and he stood in his doorway staring at them, and how nothing had been the same since. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I do not say it enough because I am not constructed for frequent declarations. But I want to say it now because it is true and because I have been given enough of what I did not know I needed that I am aware of my debts." She was very still against his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for coming here, for buying a piece of scrubland and building a coop that blew down, for bringing a pot of stew and saying it was too much food to eat alone, for fighting for your land and letting me help you fight for it, for reading to me by a campfire and for telling me the truth about what you felt, and for marrying me, and for James and for Margaret Rose, and for every morning of the past 5 years." He paused. "I was a clock that had stopped. You started me running again. I am aware of that every day." She did not say anything for a moment. He could feel the quality of her silence, the particular fullness of it, which was nothing like the empty silence he had lived in for so long. Then she turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright. "You are getting better at declarations," she said. "I have been practicing," he said. "When?" she said. "In my head," he said. "For a while." She laughed, and it was that laugh, the warm and surprised and fully real one, and she reached up and put her hand against his face, and he turned his face into it and closed his eyes for a moment. "I love you," she said. "I loved you before I knew you, I think. I loved the idea of a man who was serious about unexpected things and who could be trusted with a fence line and who would come to someone's door because it was right to come. You are exactly who I was looking for without knowing I was looking." "I was not looking," he said. "I had given up looking." "I know," she said, "which is exactly why Harriet went first." He smiled. He smiled the way he had been smiling for 4 years now, easily, genuinely, with the full machinery of his face, and she smiled back. And they sat on the porch of the house that had been built for two, and was now full of four, and the sound of a ranch at work and a life thoroughly lived. And the evening air smelled of verbena and dry grass and the creek somewhere in the dark. And Harriet, who had lived to the great old age of 7 years and shown no inclination to leave, shuffled her feathers on the porch rail and regarded the night with her amber eyes. The stars came out, one by one and then all at once, the way they always did out here. Inside, James made the pre-waking sound again, and this time it was followed by the small, definite voice of a 4-year-old who has decided he is awake. Clara started to rise, and Cyrus put his hand on her arm. "I will go," he said. He went inside. He went to the room he had built the year before James was born, that now had a bed in it and things on the walls that children put on walls, and a smell that was entirely its own. He sat on the edge of the bed, and James looked up at him with Clara's eyes in a face that was something entirely new. "Papa," James said. "I am here," Cyrus said. James considered this for a moment, found it satisfactory, and reached up with both hands in the way of small children who want to be held. Cyrus picked him up and held him in the solid, steady way, the way that says, "You are safe, I have you. This is the truth and will not change." James settled against his chest and was asleep again in minutes. Cyrus sat in the dark with his son in his arms and listened to the house around him, the particular sounds of it, the walls and the roof and the boards and the life inside all of it. And he thought that this was what he had built this house for, in the beginning, before the fever and the 7 years and the silence. He had built it for exactly this, and it had taken longer to arrive than he had planned, and had come from a direction he had not expected, and had arrived on a March morning with 6 red hens, and a woman with crooked straw hat and gold-brown eyes. He was grateful. He was more grateful than he had words for, which was all right, because the man who had had no words had spent 4 years finding them, and he would keep finding them, because Clara deserved them, and because his children deserved to hear their father say the things that were true about the world. He carried James back to the bed and settled him down and covered him and stood for a moment in the doorway looking at him, and then went to the other room where Margaret Rose was sleeping in her own small certainty, and looked at her too. Then he went back out to the porch. Clara was where he had left her, feet on the rail, looking at the stars. She heard him and turned her head, and her expression was the one she wore when everything was right, not overjoyed, not performed, just simply and genuinely at peace with where she was and who she was with. He sat down beside her, and she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet, not the absence of talking, but the presence of two people who trust the silence between them completely. Somewhere in the dark, a mockingbird was going through its repertoire, cycling through the songs of other birds the way mockingbirds do, shameless and brilliant. And the creek was audible if you listened for it, and the land lay all around them in the warm Texas dark, their land, tended and known and full of everything a person could be given if they were lucky enough to have someone bring their chickens to the right porch on the right morning and be stubborn enough to stay. Cyrus Dalton had not smiled at anything in 7 years. And now he smiled every day at all of it without trying, because all of it was worth smiling at, and he was no longer a stopped clock but a man alive in his own life, which is the simplest and most complete definition of happiness there is. The verbena bloomed along the fence. Harriet ruffled her feathers on the porch rail. The stars did what they always did out here. And in the house behind them, 2 children slept in the rooms of a home that had been built for exactly this, and had simply been waiting for the particular woman and the particular chickens, and the particular morning in March 1878, when everything that had been still began to move again.